Well, I'd like to just begin with a little bit more of an introduction of who I am, so you can at least get a little bit of sense of where I might be coming from. First, I do come from the perspective of a historian. I am trained as a Reformation historian, and so that's kind of what I'll be talking about. But specifically, as far as who I am and why I even started doing this kind of work is that when I was a junior in high school, I was part of an English class, and I walked into class one day, and my English teacher said, I looked around the class and said, let's see, oh, Esther, well, yeah, you're the only one in this class, who looks different here. So can you tell us what that feels like? We were having a discussion on race, class, and gender, I think, and that's how she started the class. And first of all, I wasn't expecting that. And as a teenager, it was an instance where difference became very isolating. I was the only one who looked different in the class. It took me a very long time to embrace difference. Years later, in graduate school, another teaching moment, I guess, I had a professor come up to me and say, because you're different, your work should look different. And he explained the work that I would be doing, which was in a predominantly Western European historical work, as something where difference could be empowering. So it took probably about almost 10 years for difference to be transformed from something isolating to something empowering for me. Add to that, I grew up in a family where both my parents were pastors. My father became a pastor when I was a young child, and my mother became a pastor when I think I was in college. So I grew up in a family where I'm basically a double PK. Add to that, I had my own spiritual journey and felt my own calling into ministry, so I too became ordained. So when we go, I'm part of the United Methodist Church. When we go to, annual conference, our family is a voting block of 3. But so, putting those two things together, the reason I'm even in this, the reason I'm doing this, the reason my work is moving in this direction is for the revitalization of what I call the church and global Christianity. And I mean that with all of its differences, which I know can be unwieldy at times. The two questions that were posed for this session were, how has the history of Asian American evangelicals informed their theological self-understanding? And how has Asian American evangelical assimilation into the broader evangelical culture shaped their theological identities? Now, I'm going to begin with the premise that a thorough answer to these questions requires a multidisciplinary approach in order to unpack the various contributing factors to Asian American history. And I'm just, glossing over these, ranging from immigration patterns to legal action concerning Asian Americans, regional and national sentiment toward Asian Americans, racial and ethnic violence, the effects of the model minority theory, to the scholarship of Asian American theologies, Asian American religious experiences, the evangelical subculture, and the growth of Asian American evangelicalism in general. So based on the history and development of Asian American evangelicalism and my work as a Reformation historian, I hope to offer a perspective that supports the blossoming of Asian American Christian thought. So in sum, I want to support an argument that advocates for something called traditioning in both ways, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. And specifically for the reinterpretation of Christian history so that it can be a rich resource for further and fuller development of Asian American theologies, including evangelical theologies. Now, what I've done in this paper that I've actually written for presentation is I've divided it into 3 sections. And the first section I have is basically a tracing of the whole history of Asian American theologies from the 60s, 70s, and 80s up through the 90s. And basically what I call that whole period is a period of gaining voice. Now, those voices tended to be a little bit more radical, and so a majority of Asian American Christians actually didn't resonate with a lot of these early Asian American theologies. So I'm not going to go into the details of that, but I just want to give you a framework that this whole first stage that I see is a period in which there's this gaining voice. The second part where I will start reading from is a place where I call the period in which we're gaining self-determination. It's actually the development of what I call Asian American evangelical theologies. So I'll start there. So since the 1990s, there's been a remarkable growth in Asian American Christianity. Despite the very popular stereotypes of Asians as representing foreign or exotic religions, a significant majority of these Asian American Christians are evangelicals. The history of the Asian American experience in mainline denominations has been punctuated with struggles to define distinctly Asian American theologies from the early stages. Although there have been mainline Protestant Anglo-Americans who were advocates for Asians by protesting discriminatory treatment of Chinese and Japanese, by lobbying against immigration legislation that excluded Asians, their efforts ultimately failed in the face of an American society that had become increasingly hostile toward Asian immigrants. By the middle of the 20th century, there was sort of a retreat among mainline denominations to a more comfortable view that basically said Asian Americans should assimilate. And this then contributed to the model minority thesis. And then that had a consequence of basically then dimming the sound of distinctly Asian voices. So I would argue that part of the growth in evangelicalism was in part the fallout from those defecting from mainline Asian American churches. While Asian American churches in mainline denominations have grown since the 1970s, they have also struggled with competition and internal strife, as well as persistent forms of cultural and institutional racism from the outside. Let me give you an example. In an area, and I'm thinking of something specific, but I don't want to highlight where it is exactly, so I'm trying to be intentionally vague, but enough for you to understand what's going on. In an area of high concentration of Asian Americans, Asian American churches compete for rental spaces in properties owned by dwindling Anglo-American congregations. In one case, a small Anglo-American congregation depends on another small, predominantly first-generation Asian congregation for its survival, namely by, one, charging excessive rents, which increase annually and far exceed the annual salary of the Asian pastor, two, frequently asking for additional funds from the renters for building maintenance and property upgrades, and three, when not met with immediate compliance, citing damage by those who borrow the building, and four, threatening to lease it to some other Asian congregation, thereby pitting Asian American congregations against each other. Now, interestingly, yesterday's conversation really focused on the importance of history, and I'm so glad they just set the foundation. In my case, let's say, for example, you don't know the history, or you decide it's not important. If you read this scenario, you would think, what's wrong with these Asian churches? They should just get their act together, and they should just figure out a way and have some sort of equitable practice. That's, I think, kind of an opinion that would come from someone that might not be as historically informed. But if you actually look at the history, you realize there's a much bigger dynamic going on here. Both the Anglo congregation and the Asian congregation belong to the same denomination. They belong to the same regional district with the same director, I'll just say. They pay similar denominational dues. Now, when the pastor of the Asian American congregation was asked, why don't you just move? The reply was very telling. The answer was, because I have heard from other Asian American pastors that it is the same all around here. Now, if something like this, oh, thank you. If something like this were to happen among kids in an elementary school, it would be called bullying. But when this happens in a mainline denomination, it is called cross-cultural ministries and sharing space. Now, such experiences confirm that Asian Americans, even as Christians of the same theological tradition, are, quote unquote, forever foreigners, treated like house guests who have overstayed their welcome. And in such cases, Asian American congregations are moderately tolerated for their financial value in exchange for space for worship. In other words, Asian Americans have had to pay a hefty price for their freedom to remain as distinctly Asian American Christians. At the same time, internal fighting, divisions and splits, as well as competition among Asian American congregations have not only fragmented a collective Asian American Christian voice, but also, ironically, have enabled Anglo-American churches to maintain their structural claim of superiority. Consequently, some Asian American congregations have somehow conducted capital campaigns and purchased their own properties. So then they become like the models. Well, why can't all of you do the same thing? And others have articulated grievances urging reform and change within the mainline denominations. But I would argue that many more have remained silent. Meanwhile, others have joined ethnic-specific denominations or non-denominational forms of Christianity. And I would say that young Asian Americans seeing this or being part of this are part of the generation flocking to evangelical Christianity, most visibly the Gen Yers and the millennials. They've decided not to return to their first-generation immigrant communities. In addition, the growth has been fueled by parachurch organizations such as Campus Crusade for Life, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, both which have significant Asian American memberships. For example, there are more than 50 evangelical Christian groups at the University of California at Berkeley and at the University of California, so UCLA. And 80% of these evangelical Christian groups are Asian American. On the East Coast, 1 out of 4 evangelical college students in New York City, at New York City colleges and universities, is Asian American. Scholars have also posited various reasons why Asian Americans, especially the younger generations, but not solely the younger generations, are attracted to evangelical Christianity rather than to mainline Protestant or Catholic Christianity. And one thing that has become clear is that these Asian American Christians, for these Asian American Christians, the evangelical subculture has become a defining point of their identity construction. It's basically the disidentification from non-evangelicals gives a chance to provide an alternative identity based not on race or ethnicity, but on faith. So they can accept the call to be apart from the world based on passages like 1 John 2:15. Likewise, Asian American sociologists have argued that Korean Americans are attracted to evangelicalism's emphasis on grounding one's true identity in one's faith. In the dilemma of having to cope with the paradox of living up to a highly racialized model minority image of being successful, while at the same time being marginalized for being the model minority, all of these factors seem to encourage Asian Americans to move toward a place where they could de-emphasize their status as a racial minority and proclaim their true identity as Christians. Now, while this might explain some of the sociological benefits of joining ethnic-specific churches, it fails to recognize that many Koreans and Chinese were Christians even before they came to the United States. They came from thriving religious communities before they became American. So for such people, the Christian identity is not necessarily a newly forged identity stemming from the American context, but a pre-existing identity that is further shaped by their Asian American identity and acculturation to forms of Asian American Christianity. And this I find true to be both predominantly in Korean American and Chinese American churches. Now another scholar, Feng-Gang Yang, also wants to add that the attraction of evangelical Christianity comes from its perceived compatibility with Confucian moral values. I mean, you kind of mentioned that a little bit. Amos mentioned that just a bit ago. But this compatibility, I would also argue, is not new to the American context. Because even if you look at the early modern period, when Italian Jesuit missionary Matteo Rizzi went to China in the 16th century, he communicated his Catholic faith as compatible with Confucian values. In fact, he adopted Confucian ideals and norms and behaviors and dress. Now, according to this, the areas of further work may be to look more at the internal history of Asian Americans themselves, because these historical contexts are pivotal for understanding the paradigm shift from mainline Protestantism to evangelicalism. And second, more attention to sort of the diasporic context that Asian Americans have been coming from before immigrating to the US. So these are some areas that we can be moving into. And I mainly talked about China and Korea, but also other Asian Americans, such as Vietnamese Americans, Filipino Americans, have also clearly embraced and been moving, some portions of them have been moving towards evangelical Christianity as well. So claiming that mainline Protestants and evangelicals approach the issue of Asian American construction in opposite ways, a scholar by the name of Russell Jung argues that mainline Protestants tend to consider themselves belonging to a racial minority group within a common history of cultural oppression and racism, while evangelical Asian Americans tend to view Asian Americans in general as a spiritual consumer target group made up of personal networks and lifestyle affinities. And therefore, evangelical churches tend to focus on family dynamics, psychological issues of self-worth and identity construction, and all of this sort of helps the growth of evangelical churches. In other words, while mainline Protestants tend to emphasize the importance of communal Asian American identity construction and Asian American struggle against racism and discrimination, evangelicals ground their emphasis on personal spiritual formation, church growth, common family patterns, psychological issues, and social needs. This is what Jung argues. Based on my own observations of particularly a predominantly Korean evangelical church in the greater LA area, many Asian Americans, even those who are what I would call marginally Christian, are drawn to the evangelical communities. I think one of the reasons is because there is this search for an extended model family, which then comes in the form of a spiritual community. And in the midst of generational tensions and pressures and a host of family dysfunctions, and also the Asian American identity in flux, Asian Americans strive for a sense of belonging in a community where they have the best chance to be fully who they are, where people understand their struggles and hopes, often because they share similar ones. Now, one complicating factor in sort of making this distinction between mainline is like this and evangelicals are like this is that many Asian American mainline congregations, as probably most of you would know this, often represent the evangelical wing within their denominations. So in fact, one can expect to find similar concerns expressed in Asian American mainline congregations. So once again, I don't think the difference is as stark as some make it out to be, but I will say this. I think the contrast between mainline and evangelical seems to be starker in institutions of theological education. I think that's where you see really the lines being drawn much more starkly. So Jung argues that Asian American evangelicals usually do not attempt to develop theologies based on a particular group's experience. in the manner that mainline theologians might. Instead, classes on Asian Americans at evangelical seminaries emphasize evangelism and ministry rather than creating or thinking of Asian American distinct theologies. On the other hand, evangelical institutions may be operating under an assimilationist model or simply responding to student training needs. At the same time, evangelical institutions accept core Christian beliefs as historic standards and do not sense a pressing need for another theology. Therefore, the critique is aimed at the perceived theological complacency in Asian American evangelicals who appear reluctant to develop their own contributions to theology. One could argue that Asian American evangelicals who have adopted Western evangelical beliefs, practices, and values have become American in a narrow sense, and that this alone does not necessarily demonstrate a lack of agency, since they are still choosing to be evangelical in an array of religious Christian choices. However, this sort of laissez-faire attitude deserves a warning. Sympathetic yet critical of Asian American acceptance, knowingly or unknowingly, of assimilationist paradigms, Matsuoka argues that Asian Americans, like all immigrants and refugees, are caught in a web of assimilation that will not easily let them go. He writes, "We find ourselves on a common road to assimilation, and our claim for Asian American cultural or ethnic distinctness is often incompatible with the powerful thrust toward homogeneity which prevails powerfully within U.S. society." And in fact, I think this is, when I read this, it helped me understand that's exactly why those years of difference, being about being isolated to being empowering, took so long, because the constant sort of pressure is to assimilate. The constant pressure is to somehow minimize difference, although obviously tides are somewhat changing. Let me just say, there's a couple more things I could say, but I just want to close with my conclusion. And that is, I first talked about gaining a voice, and those voices tended to be radical, and many churches couldn't really get behind some of these newer Asian American theologies. And the second period, I talked about gaining self-determination, finally realizing that, one could speak. My conclusion, which is my last point, is gaining a tradition. So gaining voice, gaining self-determination, gaining a tradition. The new tide of church leaders, scholars, and lay activists challenging the uncritical acceptance of dominant cultural practices invigorates the continuous flowering of Asian American theologies within mainline and evangelical churches. For example, Seung-Chan Ra writes that in the changing face of global Christianity and American evangelicalism, the question is not about the need to hear from diverse voices, but the question is, will these voices speak up? Whether these voices will be heard. And also, and I find this to be crucial, whether these voices will speak in their own voices. The time is ripe for the development of Asian American evangelical theologies that creates space for distinct contributions from various Asian American evangelical theologians addressing a myriad of issues, some addressing specific theological concepts or religious practices and religious ethics refracted through an Asian American Christian vantage point, others looking at religious values shaped by ethnic-specific congregations, still others contributing to the rise of Christian feminism, and some challenging the very hegemony of categories and labels themselves. I believe that these contributions, the reason why all of us are gathered here today, is that these contributions will arise from different disciplines, different fields, from pastors, from church leaders, from community leaders, from scholars, and that no single subject or scholar will have all the answers. So one proposition that has clarified my understanding about the future of Asian American theologies is a methodology I call traditioning, which I would adopt with some caveats. Contemporary Asian American theologians across denominations, across the theological spectrum, are beginning to favor the process of traditioning. And what that means is traditioning is a largely unconscious and ongoing process of shaping, constructing, and negotiating new traditions, practices, and theological positions that seek to address the issues and questions confronting Asian Americans. So this process is based on an understanding of the tradition as we have it, and as a perpetuation of a changing, developing identity that lives in conversation with the past while accounting for where and when we are. In other words, traditioning means there is never just one story. Some stories are not told or even formulated yet, and may never be. And even the same story can be retold in a different way. I have a great example of this. I just finished writing a paper on John Calvin. I'm not a Calvinist, but I almost didn't come today young, by the way, because of fighting this cold, but here I am. I finished writing a paper on Calvin, I find him fascinating because so many people think of him, just a common misconception or a common stereotype of Calvin is he is this sort of elite intellectual religious thinker who put forth a dogmatic program of religious change and doctrine. And yeah, he did that. But what they often forget is that in his own time, he was regarded as an innovative religious thinker, but also as a social reformer. And one of the reasons that I argue in this particular paper is the reason why he was a social reformer and why he was known for that in his own time and why people were actually attracted to Calvinist doctrine at the time was because his social location was as an immigrant. He was a French immigrant in the Genevan context, and it was such that there were so many French moving in that ethnic xenophobia and all kinds of sort of backlash were happening in Geneva. And what Calvin did was he created ways to minimize that by creating things like a refugee agency and a welfare fund just for foreigners. Because in most cities throughout Europe, as welfare systems were being formulated, they were only to care for the citizens of that city. And as French refugees came in, religious refugees came in, they didn't have citizenship. In fact, Calvin himself was not a citizen of Geneva until 9 years before his death. So he clearly understood what it meant to be an immigrant, to be in that precarious situation and to have your needs not provided for and to just kind of leave a country, their homeland. And his eyes were always looking back in France, and he always sent people back to France. But I think part of the draw of him was he understood what it meant to be marginalized. He understood what it meant to be an outsider. So that's one way to retell the story, rewrite history, and reinterpret history. And this is the kind of work that I'm involved in. So I hope some of you will join me in that. So traditioning does not limit the scope of sources for Asian American Christian identity construction to post-1965, but it enables Asian Americans to read the span of Christian history as their own. While this endeavor requires much retelling and much reinterpretation, and I presume much resistance, such efforts embody the building blocks for an Asian American Christian tradition, looking to the past and to the future, traditioning both ways. And as a historian, I am describing primarily one of my tasks and contributions. Now, if this makes any evangelical theologians nervous, one can just easily remind them that the evangelical reformers in the 16th century were doing something similar for a different context. Namely, they were reinterpreting the Bible and the Christian history for peoples in the formation of a distinctly Protestant, newly formed Christian identity. These Protestant reformers, Luther, Calvin, in fact, my book that I just wrote that's coming out next month makes this argument. These reformers had to rewrite, or at least retell, the earlier histories in order to move forward and claim new identities that were not existent before. So ultimately, the richness of Asian American theologies, in its rewriting, in its retelling, will serve the revitalization of Asian American Christianities. Thank you.